The unseen guide. Kevin decided to take a solo hike in a remote area, far from the city. It was a place he'd never been before, and he relished the idea of exploring uncharted territory. He felt confident as he'd always been an experienced hiker, but something about this trail felt different. The dense forest around him was eerily silent, save for the crunch of leaves under his boots. As he walked deeper into the woods, he noticed faint footsteps echoing his own. He stopped and looked around, but saw no one. Assuming it was his imagination, he continued. The footsteps, however, persisted, now accompanied by a soft whispering wind that seemed to carry unintelligible words. A chill ran down his spine, and Kevin quickened his pace, hoping to outrun the unsettling sounds. Suddenly, the path ahead forked into two. There were no signs, and both paths seemed equally worn. As he hesitated, trying to decide which way to go, a feeling of being watched washed over him. He turned abruptly, but again, there was nothing there. Choosing the left path, he walked faster, the sense of urgency growing with each step. Minutes turned into hours, and the forest grew denser. The sun, once high in the sky, was now obscured by thick clouds. Kevin checked his watch and realized he should have reached the trail's end by now. Panic began to set in as he realized he was lost. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost as if they were trying to communicate. The footsteps were closer now, practically breathing down his neck. In a moment of sheer desperation, Kevin shouted, "Who's there?" The forest responded with silence. Then a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. He spun around, heart pounding, and caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure darting between the trees. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he saw. It wasn't an animal, nor a person. It was something else, something he couldn't comprehend. Kevin ran, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting and warping, creating a maze of shadows. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, all overlapping, suffocating him with their intensity. Just as he felt he could run no more, he stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden cabin. Desperate for shelter, Kevin approached the cabin and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The interior was sparse, with only a few broken pieces of furniture. On the floor, in the dust, he saw footprints. His own, leading from the door to the center of the room, and then stopping abruptly. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd been here before, but when? How? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, deafening silence. The whispers, the footsteps, everything stopped. Kevin felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. There, in the doorway, stood the shadowy figure. It had no discernible features, just a dark silhouette. Kevin felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as if he knew this entity. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at him. Kevin's vision blurred, and the world around him faded to black. When he awoke, he was back on the original trail, lying on the ground. The sun was setting, and the forest was calm. Disoriented, Kevin looked around, but there was no cabin, no shadowy figure. It was as if it had all been a dream. But in his hand, he clutched a small, worn-out compass that wasn't his. Engraved on it were the words, "Never alone." The vanishing neighbor. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, life had a comfortable routine. Everyone knew everyone, and the most excitement the street saw was the occasional yard sale. Among the residents was Mr. Walker, an elderly man who lived alone in a quaint, old-fashioned house. He was friendly but reserved, keeping mostly to himself. One day, a young couple, Emily and Mark, moved into the house next door. They found Mr. Walker pleasant enough, though he seemed a bit odd. He would often stand by his window, staring out into the street, as if waiting for something. At first, they thought nothing of it, but as the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few weeks after they moved in, Emily noticed that Mr. Walker hadn't been seen for a couple of days. His curtains, usually drawn back, were now closed. Concerned, she mentioned it to Mark, who suggested they check on him. They knocked on his door, but there was no answer. After asking around, they learned that nobody had seen him recently. The local police were called, and after a brief investigation, they concluded that Mr. Walker had likely left town unexpectedly. His house was locked, and there were no signs of foul play. The neighborhood quickly returned to normal, but Emily couldn't let it go. She felt a strange connection to the old man, as if he had tried to communicate something to her. One evening, as she was unpacking some boxes, she found an old photo album that had been left behind in the house. Curious, she began flipping through the pages. To her shock, she found a photo of Mr. Walker, much younger, standing in front of the very house they now lived in. He was holding a baby girl, smiling warmly. Emily showed the photo to Mark, who was equally puzzled. They began to dig deeper, searching through old records and talking to longtime residents. They discovered that Mr. Walker had once lived in their house, decades ago, with his wife and daughter. Tragically, his wife and child had died in a car accident just down the street. Stricken with grief, he had moved to the house next door and lived there ever since, keeping a watchful eye on the place that held so many memories. As they continued to investigate, strange occurrences began happening in their home. Lights flickered, cold drafts swept through the rooms, and Emily often felt as if she were being watched. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard soft crying coming from the hallway. She woke Mark, and they both cautiously stepped out of their room, only to find the hallway empty. The crying stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. Determined to understand what was happening, Emily reached out to a local historian who specialized in the area's past. The historian revealed a disturbing detail. The house Emily and Mark now owned had been rumored to be haunted for years. Previous owners had reported similar experiences, all tied to the tragedy that had befallen Mr. Walker's family. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, Emily sat alone in the living room, feeling uneasy. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned, expecting to see Mark, but found herself staring into the eyes of a ghostly figure. It was a woman, pale and ethereal, with tears streaming down her face. Emily recognized her from the photos, Mr. Walker's wife. The figure pointed towards the window, where Emily could see the shadowy outline of Mr. Walker, standing in his house, staring back at her. Emily blinked, and the ghostly woman vanished. She rushed to the window, but the house next door was dark and empty. The next day, she called the police again, insisting they check Mr. Walker's house. This time, they broke in. Inside, they found Mr. Walker's body. He had passed away quietly, sitting in his armchair, facing the window. It seemed he had been dead for weeks, but something or someone had kept his spirit bound to the place. Emily and Mark moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. As they left, Emily glanced back at the house and thought she saw a figure in the window, watching them go. The Wrong Turn. Mia and her friends were on a road trip, eager to escape the city's bustle and enjoy the open road. They had no specific destination, preferring to let their adventure unfold spontaneously. The group was in high spirits, laughing and singing along to the radio as they drove down a winding rural highway. As night fell, they decided to find a place to stay. Mia suggested they take a scenic detour she found on an old map they had picked up at a gas station. The road was unmarked and seemed to cut through a dense forest. The group, excited for an impromptu adventure, agreed. The road quickly became narrow and rough, the trees closing in on both sides. The headlights of the car struggled to pierce the darkness. After a while, the GPS lost signal, leaving them reliant on the map and Mia's sense of direction. As they drove deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling settled over the group. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their branches intertwining overhead like a dark canopy. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Mia slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. The figure, a woman dressed in a tattered white dress, stood motionless, her face hidden by long, tangled hair. They watched in stunned silence as she slowly raised her head, revealing hollow, empty eyes. Panic set in. Mia tried to reverse, but the car's engine sputtered and died. The woman began to move towards them, her movements slow and unnatural. The friends frantically tried to start the car, but it was useless. The woman was now at the driver's side window, staring directly at Mia. Her mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the woman's expression twisted into a look of pure rage. She slammed her hands against the window, causing the glass to crack. Mia and her friends screamed, desperately trying to get the car started. Just as the glass began to splinter, the car roared to life. Mia floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the woman, who disappeared into the darkness behind them. Breathing heavily, they drove in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The road seemed endless, with no signs of civilization. The forest was oppressive, the darkness closing in around them. Eventually, they saw a dim light up ahead and pulled into what appeared to be a small, run-down gas station. Relieved, they rushed inside, explaining what had happened to the old man behind the counter. He listened quietly, then nodded solemnly. "You kids took the wrong turn," he said. "That road you're on doesn't exist on any map. It's a cursed path. That woman you saw is a spirit, trapped there after she was murdered by her lover decades ago. She lures travelers in, hoping to find her way out, but none ever do." The group was horrified, but the old man assured them they could find their way back to the main road if they left immediately. He gave them vague directions and they hurried back to the car. The drive back was tense, but they eventually found the main highway. The oppressive feeling lifted as they re-entered familiar territory. As they drove away, Mia glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the gas station disappear into the night. The relief was palpable, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Later, when they checked the map, they found no record of the detour they had taken, nor the gas station. It was as if they had never been there. The friends vowed never to speak of the incident again, but Mia couldn't forget the woman's hollow eyes and the rage in her face. She often wondered if the woman had found another way to escape her cursed fate or if she was still there, waiting for the next unfortunate traveler to take the wrong turn. The last broadcast. Jake was a radio DJ, hosting a late-night show in a small town. His program, Midnight Chills, specialized in sharing eerie stories and playing haunting music. It had a cult following, with listeners tuning in from all over the county. Jake loved his job. The quiet hours of the night suited him, and he enjoyed the thrill of the supernatural. One night, he received an anonymous call during the show. The caller's voice was deep and distorted, sending chills down Jake's spine. The caller claimed to have a story that would chill anyone to the bone. Intrigued, Jake let the caller speak. The story was about a young woman named Lily, who had gone missing years ago. She was last seen at a local radio station, working late into the night, much like Jake was now. As the caller described Lily's disappearance, Jake felt an eerie connection to the story. The caller explained that strange things began happening after Lily vanished. Equipment malfunctioned, and people reported hearing her voice over the radio, crying for help. The station eventually shut down, and the building was left abandoned. Jake felt a cold sweat form on his brow as the caller continued. "They say," the caller whispered, "that on the anniversary of her disappearance, if you tune into the old frequency, you can hear Lily's last broadcast. Her voice, calling out, trapped between the static." As the call ended, Jake felt a creeping unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the caller knew something about him, something personal. Shaking it off as a coincidence, he continued with his show. However, the story lingered in his mind. He decided to do some research and discovered that the old station mentioned by the caller was indeed real and had a tragic history. Curiosity got the better of him, and on the night of the anniversary, Jake decided to test the rumor. He tuned his radio to the old frequency mentioned by the caller. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, he heard it. A voice barely audible speaking through the noise. He leaned closer, turning up the volume. The voice was female and it was crying for help. Jake's blood ran cold. The voice matched the description of Lily's last broadcast. As he listened, the voice became clearer. "Please," it said, "help me. I'm trapped. He won't let me go." The static intensified, and the voice faded in and out. Jake felt a sense of dread as he realized the voice wasn't coming from a recording. It was live. Panicking, he tried to turn off the radio, but the knobs wouldn't budge. The voice grew more desperate, and the room around Jake seemed to darken. The temperature dropped, and he could see his breath in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the equipment in the studio began to malfunction. The radio's volume increased on its own, and the voice screamed, "He's here!" The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Jake fumbled for his phone, but it was dead. In the dim glow of the equipment, he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows. She moved closer, and Jake's heart raced. He recognized her from the old photos he had found during his research. It was Lily. She reached out, her eyes filled with terror. "Help me," she whispered, her voice overlapping with the one coming from the radio. Jake backed away, unable to move as the room grew colder. The figure of Lily began to distort, her form flickering like a faulty signal. The radio blared with static and disjointed voices, a cacophony of lost souls. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room returned to normal. The figure of Lily was gone, and the radio was silent. Jake stood there, shaken and bewildered. He quickly packed up and left the studio, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The next day, he tried to explain the incident to his boss, but no one believed him. The recordings from that night were mysteriously erased, and the frequency he had tuned into no longer existed. Jake quit his job shortly after, unable to continue working in the place where he had experienced such terror. Years later, Jake still couldn't forget that night. He occasionally tuned into the static on his radio, hoping never to hear that voice again. But deep down, he knew that somewhere, in the dark, forgotten corners of the airwaves, Lily's last broadcast still lingered, a ghostly echo of a tragedy never resolved.